Good morning. Let's begin this plenary session. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker for this opening session, Professor Elspeth Jones. Professor Elspeth Jones is Emerita Professor of the Internationalization of Higher Education, Leeds Beckett University, an Honorary Visiting Fellow, Center for Higher Education Internationalization, Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore, Milan. With over 35 years in international education, Professor Jones' specialisms include personal, professional, and employability outcomes from international mobility, strategic leadership, internationalization of the curriculum at home and abroad, global citizenship, and intercultural competence development. She is series editor for Internationalization in Higher Education, Routledge, and winner of the European Association for International Education's Award for Excellence in Research. She's chair of the European Association for International Education's expert community on internationalization at home, and a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Studies in International Education. There's no doubt that Professor Jones has published and spoken extensively on many aspects of the internationalization of higher education, one of the key terms of this year's conference theme. And we are honored to have Professor Elspeth Jones here today in this opening lecture. Welcome, Professor Jones, and thank you for sharing your expertise with us.
Well, good morning, everyone. Can we just check the sound before we start? Can you hear me okay? Yeah, good. Thank you. Well, thank you so much to Anna for inviting me more than 1 year ago to come to this beautiful city. I'm delighted to be here. And I do wish you the very best for the whole of the conference, the 36th conference of the AESLA Association. A little bit more about me, perhaps, which isn't in my biography, is that my first degree is in linguistics and my master's degree is in applied linguistics, and so I feel almost as though I'm at home with my friends here, and I also speak a number of languages, so that's another part of it. And I've spent a lot of my time living in other countries, particularly in Singapore and Japan. So I'm very happy to be in this very international group of people, and I do thank Anna very much for this kind invitation. So you've heard a little bit about me, and it's difficult to get to know you like this in a big audience, but I do like to get a sense of it. And I read the abstracts, or the ones I could read. I read some of the Spanish ones, but not very well. But it's a very, very interesting conference. Some fantastic papers are going to be here. And so I assume some of those presenters are in the audience. But I'm interested to know if you all work in Spanish universities. Is there anybody here who doesn't work in a university in Spain? Okay. Is there anybody who doesn't work in another university within Europe? Anybody from outside Europe? Okay, excellent. So we've got some interesting. So can you just tell us where you're from? Which university? A university. Oh, okay. From Europe, okay, yeah. So anybody not from a European university, yeah? Okay, US. Anybody, yeah?
Boston College.
Boston College. I've also spoken there. Thank you, lovely place, yeah.
University of Queensland, Australia.
Okay, so we've got people from far and wide. Anybody further than Queensland? No? Yes?
Argentina, Universidad Nacional de Córdoba.
Oh, excellent. Right, so we've got a... Did I miss somebody? Is there... Yeah? Oh, fantastic. So we've got a very, very international audience. That's great. Am I the only person who doesn't understand Spanish very well? Spanish isn't one of my languages, so I'm at a disadvantage here. But anyway, so it's great to see so many people here. Now, when I was at university and we were studying languages, they said that there was an expectation, in a sense, that many people, in terms of the employability outcomes of their university studies, many people would become interpreters or translators. And people outside the field of language study, outside the field of interpreting, they assumed the only thing that linguists would be able to do would be to translate or interpret. So the question, are you going to go and work for the European Commission or something? And it was a long time before we began to understand that language capability has much more to offer in terms of employability. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but later on. So the language part of my talk is going to come later, because this is the kind of format that I want to look at. First of all, I'm going to look at transformative internationalization and the outcomes of internationalization in terms of employability. Then I want to look at inclusive internationalization for all students and the role of languages, and that will also include English as a medium of instruction. So they're the three sections of my talk, just so that you can be prepared for what's coming. First of all, then, what do we mean by internationalization? I guess some people will be familiar with some definitions. Jane Knight's definition is very famously used, but I prefer this one, which is partly written by Laura Howard in the front here, a member of the University of Cardiff. And the reason why I like this is because it explains why we want to internationalize. So it tells us, first of all, that it's an intentional process. It won't happen unless we make an effort to make it happen. It talks about international, intercultural, and global dimensions, all very, very important, and I will talk more about that in a few minutes. And it talks about the purpose, functions, and delivery of post-secondary education. So it's every aspect of university life. But it then says, importantly, it's in order to enhance the quality of education and research. It's all about the quality of what we do. And very, very importantly, underlined, it's for all students and staff, everybody in the institution. It's not simply those who have a study abroad experience, or like yourself, speak other languages or spend time in other countries, but it's for all students and staff, and in order to make a meaningful contribution to society. So this was written as part of a very, very important study in 2015, and I prefer to use this definition here, so I think it's really important. Now, we have many studies now which show that international experience, if we're talking about mobility, an experience travelling to another country and spending time there can offer significant benefits to students. And particularly the outcomes which people are focusing on are what are sometimes called employability skills, they're sometimes called transferable skills, soft skills, transversal skills, but they are not specifically to do with speaking a language or to do with something specific about a program, but really the development of skills which arise from being in other countries and spending time with people who you perceive to be different from yourself. So we know that things are happening there, and we also know that in countries, every country that I've ever looked at, employers are asked, what kinds of skills are you looking for from graduates of a university? Regardless of the subject that they study, employers are asked regularly what they're looking for. Now, the World Economic Forum, I'm giving you this list because this is one from January 16. They haven't updated this. This is the latest version. And these are the skills that they think are going to be important for 2020. I'm guessing these are quite familiar to you. Not necessarily this list, but this kind of thing. And these are the kinds of soft skills that I was talking about just now. But very interestingly, these are exactly the kinds of skills which are developed through those international experiences. And I've made reference to a paper of mine where you can look at more detail if you want. And I've got the list of the bibliography at the end of my presentation for those who are interested. So we know that international travel, international experiences enhances the range of the type of skills that employers are looking for. And it's very, very important. It was emphasized also when this is a slightly older one and a UK-based one, where John Fielden and his colleagues said that employers are actually looking for graduates with first-hand experience of living and working among other cultures. And this was reinforced by the Erasmus Impact Study in 2014. So the employers are very, very keen to see people who have an international experience. In fact, they found that 92% of employers are actually looking for transversal skills. So they don't necessarily say that they want to see people who have studied abroad, although, as you can see in the diagram, 64% of employers say that they're looking for people with an international experience. But 92% are looking for transversal skills. And what we can do, if we're interested in internationalization and helping our students to develop, is to emphasize the benefits of internationalization for the development of those skills. Now, when I say internationalization in that context, I'm talking about international experience, but I'm going to come back to that and think about all of the students, as I said earlier. So, are we okay? Are you following me? I'm speaking too quickly. It's okay. In the UK, there's an organisation called UUK International. They found that mobile students, people who've been on an Erasmus experience, earn higher grades and receive higher salaries. But they also found that participation in mobility is very variable. So people from, I hope you can read that, people from more disadvantaged backgrounds, only 3.5% of British students took part in mobility programs, whereas for people from more advantaged backgrounds, there was 6.4% participation rate. It's pathetic, isn't it? Hopeless. So even 6.4% means a very low number of students who are actually travelling to another country and gaining the kinds of skills that we've just been talking about. And in fact, the bottom graph there says that students from managerial and professional occupation backgrounds were almost 5 times more likely to be mobile than students who had from families where the family had never worked or they were unemployed, there was long-term unemployment in the family. Okay, so what are the kinds of skills which have been shown to be developed through international experience? And I'll just give you an example from some of my own research from 2010 and 2012. And I've divided them into, first of all, the things which I see as developing intercultural competence. So working with other people, and whether it's in another country or at home. So these are some of the things that I found had been developed. And then secondly, in terms of employability skills, these were the kinds of skills that students had developed. And all of these, as you can see, link in with the kind of list that was provided by the World Economic Forum. Now, I think it's important at this point just to say that this doesn't always happen. And I don't know if you're familiar with a linguist in the UK called Jim Coleman, but he did a study in the 1990s which found that language students from the UK who studied abroad, actually there was a tendency for some of those students to come back more xenophobic, less interested in the country of the language that they were studying than before they left. Now, I hope things have moved on since those days, but we do really need to work very, very hard at preparing our students and giving them a very good mobility experience. So we need to think about why they're taking part in a period abroad and preparing them for that. But we also need to think about reviewing that experience on return. How can we help them understand the skills that they've gained as part of their study abroad experience? But really, really importantly, the most successful outcomes from study abroad have been shown that while they're away, students are given tasks, are given questions by their staff back at home, by academics at home, questioning them about ethnography, about what they're observing, giving them tasks to engage with people as part of the programme. And there's a lot of interesting work been done on this, and Gabrielle Weber-Bosley is one who's done a lot of work on that. But this is the kind of cycle which will help students to get the most from their overseas experience. Importantly, though, and as I've said there, we need to help them to review the experience on return, because one of the issues is that we don't really help students to articulate those skills to potential employers. So they will say, oh, I volunteered in Africa, I had a fantastic time. But they don't say, actually, that helped me to develop my leadership skills, my communication skills. I became better at working with people with very different backgrounds from myself. They don't say those things. That's what the employer wants to hear. But students are usually so excited by their experience. This is why that review period is very, very important if we want to help them develop employability skills or develop the capacity to talk about the skills they've developed in a way that their employers, future employers, will understand. And so with Hans de Wit, as part of an article in University World News, we wrote this, the idea that we should use the word internationalization less and connect it more to the international and intercultural dimensions of personal transferable skills and learning outcomes. And that goes back to the definition of internationalization that I mentioned earlier, about that it's international, intercultural, and it's very, very important that we think in those terms. So I said that I thought the mobility participation rate in the UK is pathetic. How about in Spain? I know you are the biggest receiving country for Erasmus students, I know that, but does anybody know what the overall participation rate for Spanish students is? No? Okay, I don't know the full range either, but how about in your institution? What proportion of students in your institution have an international, it doesn't have to be Erasmus, study, work, volunteering experience as part of their programme? So 0 to 10%, UK is very bad. Anybody else is in their institution, would you say the mobility participation is 0 to 10%? I've got one small hand up at the front here. Nobody wants to admit that. Okay, at the back. 11 to 20%. Can you just put your hand up if you think it's 11 to 20% in your institution? Yeah? Yeah? More than 20%. Fantastic. There's a lot of people who haven't put their hands up. Does that mean less than 0? Okay. Well, congratulations to those who are over the 20% band, but I don't know if you know, the European target for 2020, the target for mobility participation is 20%. So what about the 80%? I've tried to explain here all of the benefits of an international experience, of a mobility experience. And we're really in a position now where we're still talking about mobility being very important. Mobility is important, but that's really not what internationalization is all about, it's only about, because it's only going to ever reach a proportion of the students, a small proportion, 20% if that's the target. So that's fine, but we need to think differently about internationalization if we're going to incorporate the 80% or more, 90%, 95% in the UK who do not have a study abroad experience. So, how do we do that? Now, I'm very interested in the question as to whether the international element is crucial or whether it's the experiential learning part of that abroad experience. And I've got a PhD student at the moment, I'm delighted, who's doing a study on this. I can't give you any results because we're at the very beginning of this, but she's looking to see whether students who do an experiential learning activity, a work placement in Italy, whether they receive the same kind of transferable skills benefits as students who have an international work placement. So I'm very excited about that. But at the moment, we don't know. You're probably familiar with Kolb's cycle of experiential learning, where we look at the experience itself, the reflection on the experience, the abstraction of that experience, leading back into more active experimentation. I'm sure you're familiar with those reflection cycles, whether it's Kolb or somebody else. This just happens to be Kolb's cycle. But there is an experiential learning movement, which again, I'm not sure whether you're familiar with the concept of experiential learning more generally. And there's one of the interesting guys I found very interesting to read is Jack Meseroff, who is in the US. And he talks about disorienting dilemmas. And he says that when you're in another country, you're constantly presented by what he calls disorienting dilemmas. You're constantly challenged by something that you face, you find something difficult, find something tricky. And it is that challenge which helps you change your mindset to think, oh, well, maybe not everybody does things the same way that I do, or maybe I need to think differently about how other parts of the world think about this. The example that I often give, because I've traveled to more than 60 countries, and I think I regard myself as reasonably international, but the one thing that I'm challenged by every country I go into is the bus, taking the bus in a country, because you never know, nobody tells you how to do it. Usually trains are very easy. You buy your ticket, maybe you buy it in the wall, maybe you go to the ticket office, you get on the train, you know where you're going. Buses, no. Well, first of all, if you don't understand the language, sometimes you don't know which is the correct stop to get off at. But more importantly, where do you buy your ticket? Do you buy your ticket on the bus? Do you have to have a card beforehand? Do you have to go to the kiosk, a tabac or something like that to get your ticket before you get on the bus? Do you get on at the front, in the middle, at the back? Is there a conductor that you have to speak to? And, it's so complicated in every country. Well, it's not complicated, it's just that every country is different. And if you don't live there, you don't know how to do it. So that's a very small example of a disorienting dilemma that disorients me wherever I go. So far, I've been taking taxis in Cadiz, because I haven't. The taxis are so cheap anyway, but, getting on the bus, I haven't got my head around that. So this idea of disorienting dilemmas that helps us change our mindset. And I think we don't have to travel to encounter that kind of cultural otherness that I'm talking about there. And I want to go into that now, because I want to talk about making internationalization more inclusive and thinking about internationalization of the curriculum at home. Now, I wrote with Jos Balen a definition of internationalization at home in 2015. Again, we've got purposeful, integrating international, intercultural dimensions, both the formal, the taught curriculum, and the informal curriculum, the experience of students in a university, for all students, again, all students, but within domestic learning environments. So it may be in the university, it may be that you give them the opportunity for a work placement in another part of the city, for example. And we, as part of my group in the European Association for International Education, we came up with 10 key points about internationalization at home. I know you can't read that, but there is soon going to be a blog about this on the EAIE website. But I want to highlight these three in particular, because it points out that we aim to develop international and intercultural perspectives through internationalized learning outcomes in the formal curriculum, the assessed curriculum, and purposefully using the cultural diversity which we have in the classroom for the kind of inclusive learning, teaching and assessment practice that I've been talking about, but creating opportunities to engage with cultural others in local society, also very important. Now, as I've been walking around Cadiz, this is my first visit. I think it's an absolutely fabulous city. One of my misconceptions, I think, when I was thinking about coming here, it's so close to North Africa. I assumed I would see lots of black faces around the city, and actually, I haven't seen very many at all. And so, we tend to think that if somebody looks different from ourselves, maybe, I've got white skin, somebody else has black skin or different colour skins, we tend to think that of cultural difference may be to do with the colour of skin. We tend to also think of it in terms of nationality, in terms of religion. But what I would like to talk about, really, in terms of making the most of an internationalization at home experience, is thinking about culture as being a much, much broader question than that, and using it as a teaching resource. Starting with, obviously, we have many domestic and international students and staff, and you're all a very diverse group in terms of different countries that you work in or come from. We have students who are returning from their study abroad period or time spent in another country, and we have engagement with different cultures in our local society. I can't speak for your individual institution, but most institutions have different types of organisations around the city or around the area that they can tap into. And so I want to give you some examples of what we did at my university in Leeds when we were working on this broad concept of culture. So as well as thinking about working with, say, refugees and asylum seekers, is one opportunity. We had people anybody who had, for example, their English was not so good, we had people who volunteered to work with them to develop their English, but in other cases where they were very highly qualified, but the qualifications were not necessarily recognised, we had people volunteer to help them have their qualifications recognised in the UK. All of these offered students exposure to people who they considered to be different from themselves, other than themselves. Here, again, international, okay? But internationalization at home. Then, local faith or migrant communities. So in the city of Leeds, there are cultural centres or heritage centres for people from the Czech Republic, Poland, people from different Indian backgrounds, and so on. So we worked with some of those community centres, and students worked or volunteered or did other activities there. But let's take it a step further now. We also had a relationship with a home for severely disabled children. Now, if you are not yourself severely disabled, this is an opportunity for, I believe, for cultural learning, in that the culture of a severely disabled person is very, very different from yours if you are not severely disabled. So we found that the type of students who are working with these young people, they were, for example, from the education department, they were from physiotherapy, and they were working with these people, and they found it incredibly enriching. And that notion of cultural otherness, of the disorienting dilemmas that I was talking about, this is all within our city. And so the students were challenged in ways that they might not have been otherwise, but without leaving the country without even leaving the city. Other examples, a shelter for drug addicts or people who abused alcohol. Again, we had people working in that centre, and similar kind of shock results came from this, and we found that the students were articulating the same kinds of skills that they were developing as we were finding from the students who'd been studying or working in other countries. And then finally, another example, or two other examples, a women's refuge, a refuge for women who faced abuse in the domestic environment. They were in shelter. Again, if you haven't had that experience, it's a very different cultural experience. Or a home for looked after children. I don't know whether you understand that term, but it means where children have been taken away from their parents for whatever reason, or they don't have parents, or so they are taken care of by the city or by the state. Again, all of these experiences, if you yourself are have not had those experiences before, these are very, very challenging environments for you to build your skills and to develop different perspectives on what you do. So these are some of the ways that we tried to reach the 100%, to try to internationalize the curriculum for all of our students. And that kind of transformational internationalization, I believe, can come about through any kind of encounter with cultural otherness, and it doesn't have to be in another country. It doesn't have to be that international engagement. It doesn't have to be about mobility. So in a way, it would be better to call it interculturalization rather than internationalization, but it's a very, very difficult word. So it's not going to catch on, but that's really the spirit of it. So internationalization at home means thinking about the cultural diversity in our own cities in a very, very different way. Okay, so I'll move on then to my third section, which is about the role of languages. Can there be internationalization without language study, and what role do languages play? So I've got a room full of linguists. If I take the first of those questions, can there be internationalization without language study? I'm guessing you will say no. It's really crucial. It's the most important part of it. And it's true. Internationalization itself needs a common language. So a lot of what we do, we need a lingua franca for this. We need to be able to communicate with people from other countries, whether it's about partnerships, collaborative research, conferences like this, publications, student recruitment. Many, many different aspects of internationalization needs a common language. And obviously, the students in a certain country will usually, unless they're studying in English as a medium of instruction program, will usually be expected to understand what's happening in the language of that country. So there is a lingua franca element to a lot of the work that we do in terms of internationalization. And I want to mention an article that I wrote a few years ago now, in 2012, which looks at languages and intercultural competence as part of what I was saying. This was to do with, I read an article by a guy who'd been a very senior member of the American government, who said that actually language study was a waste of time because we will soon all have universal translators that we carry around with us. I'm a big Star Trek fan. I look forward to the day that I have my own universal translator, but until then, it's getting better, isn't it? Translation is getting better on iPhones or whatever you've got, but it's never going to get us the whole way, because I think this is one of the important elements. We need to engage with alternative worldviews. We need to think about how we communicate, not just what we communicate. So the universal translator will only ever change the words. It won't necessarily help us in terms of how we communicate with people. And I think by actually studying languages which have a different form from our own language, it encourages us to deconstruct our own personal linguistic world, to tolerate ambiguity and embrace cultural otherness. Now, I don't know if you can remember back to your very first language study, when you very first started learning a language, and if you felt differently or not. I find it very difficult because I started learning French when I was 7. I was part of an experiment in a UK school. And so I don't really remember much of my life before I was 7, to be honest. But the idea that, so from the age of 7, I knew that if somebody says, table in English, it may not necessarily be the same in other languages. It may be, well, first of all, it's going to be a different word, but it may also have a different concept. I'll come back to that in a second. So deconstructing the linguistic world helps us also to think, well, maybe, okay, if the language is different, maybe the way they think about the language is different, or the way they use the language is different. So that tolerance of ambiguity is a really important starting point for the kind of intercultural competence development that I've been talking about, realizing that you don't always understand everything. That's a really, really important starting point for all of our students. And as linguists, we understand that you can't always do a direct translation, and that we know that cultural others may not see the world in a different way. Is anybody a fan of Star Trek? Just a few. There's a fabulous Next Generation episode which is all about language. If you want to show your students something which will really bring it home to them, why they need to understand the cultural background to language, it's called Darmok. And it sees Captain Picard meeting an alien vessel, and they're using the universal translator. They're saying words that they each understand, but they have no idea what the other is saying. So the guy who is the captain of the other ship keeps talking about Darmok and Jalab at Tanagra. And this is supposed to mean something to Captain Picard. No idea. Anyway, through a series of events, it turns out that they speak in metaphor. They talk about their cultural history, and the reference to Darmok and Jalab at Tanagra meant fighting together and working together against a common enemy. And eventually, of course, Captain Picard figures it out because he's also a great historian. So that's the story behind it. But actually, it's a really important metaphor for our students as well. This is the reason why we need to have the cultural background for language study, as well as being able to actually use the words involved. Let me give you some examples. Okay. I guess you recognize this. And what color would you, in English, I think I can probably universally say, we would say red for that top color. But if you think about your own language and other languages you know, is it always red? Yeah? Okay. How about that? What is it? Amber in Spanish. Okay. So one of the few words I know in Spanish is naranja, but that clearly means something different. In some countries, in some languages, they use orange for this term, and in some they use yellow. What about the bottom one? This is the really key one. What's the bottom color? Green? Anybody not green? Okay. In Japanese, it's blue, and in the same vein, in Russian, the Russian language has different words for the different shades of blue in a way that in English we don't differentiate between those. Certainly in English we would say green, but as I say, in Japan it's blue. The traffic light turns red, yellow, blue. Okay, here's another example. In English, all of these pictures involve the word chair. It doesn't in French, and they don't in German. How about in languages that you know about, would they involve chair? Are they chairs? Okay. So in French, we've got the difference between fauteuil and chairs. In German, Sessel and Stuhl. And so, you know, we have a different, we divide the word, these things up in a different way. This is a really simple, in a way, silly example, just to illustrate the way that we divide up the linguistic world in ways which students won't necessarily understand. And it's at the basis of some of the errors that our students make when they're speaking foreign languages. But it becomes much, much more important when we start thinking about the ways words are used in different languages. So cultural sensitivity is very, very different. And every time, when I'm in France and somebody says something to me about handicapé, it really shocks me, because handicapped is a word which we would never, ever use in the UK. Anyway, maybe it's different in American English, I don't know. But we would never say handicapped. It's always people with disabilities, if you have a disability. But here, this is actually, you know, a common sign that you see in France. Si vous prenez ma place, prenez mon handicap. And, you know, take my disability if you want my parking place, is what that means. So the cultural sensitivity behind that kind of translation is very, very important. So there are many benefits of language study to intercultural competence and the development of those things. But I think there's also one really significant problem. There may be other problems, but the one problem I want to talk about is that I've come across people who are specialists in a certain language, but they find it very difficult to speak to people unless they can use that language. So, for example, if they meet with people from a country where they don't speak the language, they don't necessarily have the intercultural competence, the cross-cultural capability to work with people in those languages. Now, in contrast, people who teach English for academic purposes, English for specific purposes, without knowing another language, are often very, very good at intercultural competence because they have to work across languages all the time. So I think a really big challenge for specialist linguists is to move beyond any kind of culture-specific knowledge and think outside those languages that they know to become interculturalists in a more specialized way. Now, I'm not suggesting this is you, and I'm not suggesting everybody is in the same position, but I have certainly met many people who are incredibly fluent in another language. They know everything about a country where that language is spoken, and yet put them in a different country, and they don't necessarily know how to deal with it. I think it's just a slight issue for us. I'm moving now to English as a medium of instruction, because obviously this is part of it. And I think an important thing to remember is that teaching the kind of content programs that we have through English is not a goal of internationalization, but it's just a vehicle for making it happen. Now, often particularly across the European continent, we've focused so much on mobility through the Erasmus program. We've focused on English as a medium of instruction. We tend to think that's what internationalization is about. If I turn my program into a course which is delivered through English, then that will internationalize the curriculum. No, it doesn't. It simply delivers exactly the same content in a different language. And it doesn't necessarily change the cultural dimensions in the way that I've talked about. So we have to think about the content of our programs as well as the means by which we deliver it, i.e. through a common language, English or another lingua franca. It's often been used by countries like the Netherlands or Denmark, Sweden, for delivering programs in order to attract people from other countries, because they usually don't expect people to be able to speak some of those less widely used languages. That's a mouthful, isn't it? That's often how it's described in the UK, lesser taught and less widely used languages to recruit international students. But in fact, there are, I'm sure you're familiar with this if you're already involved in English as a medium of instruction delivery, there are so many issues raised by it. So, for example, the impact of any native speakers that you have in the class. If you're delivering in English and there are some English native speakers, some Spanish speakers, some people from the Netherlands or Germany or whatever, very, very difficult to have a level playing field if you've got a kind of assumed superiority of those native speakers. That can affect the learning and teaching process. What about the threshold for language competence? How do we know who we can admit to these programs? What level do we expect them to have, and how do we measure it? It's not just the skills of students, but also the skills of teachers which need to be developed in many countries. I'm sure I'm not talking to the people who need that development here, but it is very, very often the case in other countries that I've worked in. And then we have the situation where we've got sometimes non-native speakers of the language and non-native students of the language working together. So there are sometimes quality issues. I had an example in the Netherlands where there's a class full of basically Dutch students. The teacher is a Dutch teacher, and yet it's an English as a medium of instruction program. So the teacher's speaking in English, the students are speaking in English, and they just say, well, why don't we just speak Dutch? We all understand Dutch. Why don't we do this? So you do get situations like that. And then we've got to think about the quality and standards relating to teaching and assessment, thinking about which academics are going to be capable or willing to deliver in English. Again, you know, you're all linguists, so you may not be thinking about these as issues, but for many people in content programs who have the kind of academic background but don't necessarily have the language, this is a major issue. And appropriate support and resources. Does the library have sufficient books and so on to deliver it? Are we supporting students through the program by developing their language, and how does that all work? What is the role of translation, proofreading services, the role of native speakers reading an essay and supporting students in that way? So there are many, many kind of quality aspects of that. Do we allow these things to happen or not? Do we want to turn it into a bilingual campus? Are we thinking about signage and websites, or is it just an isolated program over there that isn't really going to be integrated into the university's life? And often, and I'm sure this is not the case in this room, things which are introduced top-down by university management or policymakers are not necessarily driven and developed through consultation with the people who are going to deliver it and the key stakeholders involved. So, if we get a domination of English or another lingua franca in delivery programs in different countries, what about the implications for the local language? And in some of those countries where there have been many English medium programs delivered, there is concern about what does this mean for the local language. You may be familiar, for example, with the case of the Politecnico di Milano a few years ago. They decided to deliver all their master's programs in English. And there was a massive outcry, a national outcry actually, to say, what about the Italian culture? We're going to lose this if we deliver through English, and we won't stand for it. And in fact, the Politecnico di Milano changed their policy as a result of this. So the implications for the local language is very, very important. And what about then publication? We shouldn't expect everybody to be publishing in English, and yet, as researchers, we tend to go to languages where we understand the language. We tend not to search do Google searches in other languages, especially languages we don't have a clue about. And this is where the universal translator will be incredibly helpful, especially if it is a universal Google understanding of where we can find these things and actually learn more about other parts of the world and academic publications elsewhere. secondary school, the leading up to university, how do we make sure that we are developing school English or lingua franca to enable students to take part in those programs when they join the university? So there are those kinds of issues and potential social divisions, in fact, where access from lower socioeconomic groups may be limited, or the idea that the national identity will be undermined. So there are many different issues here. And we still don't know the consequences or the outcomes of delivering in English or other lingua franca, because it's still a relatively new field. So we're not quite sure where we are. So, to come back to my question for this section, is speaking another language an essential element of intercultural competence? Well, I think it is important, but I don't think it's absolutely crucial, is my view. And I speak as a linguist, so it's not that I'm decrying the value of languages. I think you can become interculturally competent without speaking another language. But I did do a survey just to finish my presentation. I did a very brief survey on social media asking people how knowledge of another language had affected their global outlook. And this was one of the responses that I got, which I like. So this isn't somebody who we would consider to be a linguist, it's just somebody who happens to speak another language. And the idea that our views and assumptions within our native culture are very arbitrary, and we see the world from, very narrow perspective. And I am not going to talk about Brexit, but this is exactly one of the issues, okay? And we need more people to think in this way, rather than the way that some of my fellow country people do. So, is speaking another language an essential element? Language learning can help to develop intercultural competence. I hope I've given you some examples here, but it's not enough alone, and there are plenty of monolinguals who have developed excellent intercultural competence, is my parting shot on this point. And this is a summary of what I've tried to do in this presentation, which I hope has been of interest, and I'd like to thank you for listening. Yeah, sure.
Thank you, Elspeth. I've myself has done some research on intercultural competence, and you've certainly stirred my ideas and my mind with this very enlightening and inspiring and entertaining presentation, I would say. Indeed, I think, as you've said, we need to engage with alternative world views regarding what culture is and what interculturality implies. So let's see if the audience has any questions for you. Any questions? There's somebody at the back. Just hold on a second.
Elspeth, thank you very much. I did enjoy that, very interesting. My name's Alison Noble. I'm British, as you can hear. But I've lived for over 20 years in Antwerp, in Belgium. We're from Antwerp Maritime Academy, and other colleague here from Jahr der Hochschule in Germany. I was very interested in some of the statistics that you gave from Britain, mainly, and also in the fact, and perhaps this was probably intentional, that you focus on the formal aspect of mobility. I think we've moved on a decade from some of your quotes and statistics, and I did just wonder if you agree that nowadays many young people in their 20s have a vast range of informal experiential experience. That's two words rather the same there, but you know what I mean, in that people travel so much, they go and work abroad in their holidays. Certainly that's the case within mainland Europe, I would say, and I don't want to talk about Brexit either, but you know, I think we would see the situation very differently from a Belgian perspective. It's just a reflection.
Well, it's a very interesting and important point, and I'll start by saying that we're in a European context here, and that you're absolutely right. There is a lot of informal mobility for all kinds of reasons. It's very difficult to track that. I think it's almost certainly the case that that is also socially associated. Certainly within the UK, there is a lot of travel. There are also lots of package holidays where people go and spend 2 weeks in Marbella, for example. They probably don't speak Spanish other than, you know, dos cervezas por favor, or something, you know, everybody knows that. So just because people are traveling doesn't mean that they are actually gaining those skills. That's one thing. But there is a concept in the Netherlands in particular of internationalization by bicycle, as you know, so going across the border from Germany to the Netherlands and so on. So yes, there is a lot of movement around Europe. But I think if we only think about Europe, we are also missing some of the issues for countries around the world. And I'm guessing that, say, for our colleague from Argentina, if he's still here, certainly from Australia, that kind of mobility is not as obvious. And we have somebody from Canada and the States. Much, much more difficult in those huge countries which are kind of isolated in a sense from proximity to other countries. It's a much more difficult question. So I think you're really right to raise that point. I don't think it's automatic. I don't think it's automatic that people spending time in other countries will gain those skills. And that's why I tried to emphasize the kind of route that we should go down. And I also think it's socially referenced. There is the opposite version of that, which is beginning to be discussed in Australia, which is that if it's the case that we have so many students who've travelled a lot, and there's also in Australia, it's a massively diverse immigrant population based around cities. So most of the universities are in cities which have very, very diverse populations from other countries. They are now, the universities are becoming concerned that the universities are lagging behind in preparing because they don't realise how much diversity and how much travel people have undertaken before they come to university. And the content of curricula in universities is too narrow for that diversity. So it's a really interesting question. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I do agree with you as well, especially about the, you know, perhaps the income levels and how this enables people to travel. But I still do believe that, you know, perhaps young people are internationally savvy, if you like.
And I thought nobody would vote for Brexit. You know, I think we've got to move beyond our own kind of echo chamber a little bit and our own social class, as it were, or where we are in society.
Gracias. Thank you so much. I really have enjoyed your presentation. My name is Carmen Carracelas Juncal, and I'm from Southern Mississippi. And I work with study abroad. That's one of my interests. And I really enjoyed how you presented that, how important it is to prepare students before they come, and then kind of brief them afterwards with their experiential cycle. But there is one thing I think that we're missing, and it is what happens when they are abroad. For example, the programs that receive them here, for example, in Spain, are they ready? Just because they come here, like you say, doesn't mean that they transform themselves, that they know how to utilize this experience in order to gain the most about intercultural communication, for example, even linguistic gains. That is a fallacy. We all think, oh, they'll go for a semester, a year, and they'll come fluent. That's not so. So I think there is a responsibility for all the programs that house them, wherever they are in the world, to really take into account this internationalization strand as well. Just because they're here, they don't become intercultural competent.
Yeah.
And so there is more that needs to be done with the curriculum while they're abroad. What do you think?
Absolutely, and I think that's emphasised by first of all, the definition of internationalisation, where it's got the word intentional. It won't happen automatically. In the internationalisation at home, we included purposeful, so we must be purposeful, intentional. I also, in that cycle that I talked about in terms of preparation for study abroad and on return, the box at the bottom, the interaction with students while they're in another country, the preparation's fantastic, but interacting with them while they're abroad seems to be producing the best results. I can recommend several research articles for you if you're interested.
Yes, I would.
Including one aspect is around that kind of ethnographic questioning that I've talked about. Another is around using the use of reflective journals, where students are writing about their experience, sending that back to the university and getting comments back as they're taking part in the study abroad experience. So there is a lot about that in the research literature.
But that's still the original institution. But what about the institutions that receive them here? That's what I'm talking about also. Yes, because yes, the preparation is there, we can follow up, we can ask them to reflect.
Yeah.
But while they're in some other country and they're taking classes somewhere else, like for example here at the UCA, how do we know what's going on in the classroom? They really, what I'm thinking is that there has to be a revolution also from the institutions that are receiving these students and get on the program too, get with the program, whatever. So I understand, and yes, I would love to get some more references.
I can
Thank
talk
you
to you
so
later,
much.
Okay.
Hi, Joan Tomás Pujola from the University of Barcelona. Thank you very much. It was a very lengthy talk. I would like to know a strategy of using telecollaboration for the purpose of internalization, because I think, you are developing in this world and this world of employability, you are developing two things at the same, or three things at the same time, internalizing intercultural competence and digital competence. So what do you think? Do you have any studies or anything?
Yes, there are some very, very interesting programs and some research on that. Do you know about there's a movement in, it started in SUNY in New York called the Collaborative Online Intercultural International Learning, COIL, and they have an annual conference and they produce books and articles. There's all kinds of things. I can give you that information. More locally, there's very interesting work being done across Europe on this, and I think the problem sometimes is that people who are interested in certain types of content do not always necessarily know how best to make use of those kind of online collaboration, and are not necessarily good at the technical side of it, but as these things become easier, there's more and more of it happening. And so again, I can give you several references if you're interested, but basically, if you Google COIL, C-O-I-L, you will find things happening all over the world on that kind of collaborative work.
Hi, thank you very much for this very inspiring presentation. I'm Basi Mocanu from Universidad de Lleida, and I'm studying the Erasmus program across different contexts in Europe, so northern, eastern, and southern. So from my own research, I realized that social class in study abroad is mainly about middle or middle-high students going to different places, but it actually depends on the context too. Like the wealthier ones will go to the north, like less wealthy ones will go to the east, and then south will be a little bit of a mixture, or at least that's what I have found out until now. And then you realize that actually different expectations are related to different places. And so my question is a little bit related to the fact that you were offering as a solution for closing the gap, like having programs at home, domestic programs. So if, like in a world where they actually choose very strategically the place where they will go, because it will be associated with a certain kind of experience, certain kind of skills. For example, if you go to Finland, an employer will think you are a certain kind of person. So if you even you choose strategically the context, is like a domestic program going to close the gap and help those students who are left behind.
If it's something which is to do with a specific country, then clearly, only visiting the country or spending time there is going to have that kind of effect. I think what I was talking about was giving students alternative opportunities for particularly the intercultural elements and the kind of skills development that we've talked about in relation to mobility. So you're right in terms of the kind of the choices people make in terms of costs involved. So I did some work in Romania, and they found that the students who were going there were often the kind of the poorer end of the mobility spectrum, but they found it fantastic because it's a great country and it's very cheap, and it worked really well. But no, you're right. But even so, we've still got to reach the other proportion of people, and even if it's only a kind of second best opportunity. Thinking about it realistically, many people in a country will ultimately stay to live and work at home. So people who travel around the world to work and study, we are relatively few. And so people really need exposure and support with that kind of domestic context to be able to help them to live and work in future as professionals in a diverse society. So in a way, it's not necessarily second best. It could actually be, for many people, it could be the best option. So I think I think what I'm trying to say is, it's very, very complex. And if your government is saying we must increase mobility, I'm really asking you to say why. Is this going to work? Is this the best thing we can do? What can we do instead? That's what I'm trying to say here.
Okay, thank you.
One more question down here, just down here. And then
I will be very brief. Thank you so much. It was a lovely presentation. My name is Marisa Gordella from the University of Queensland in Australia. We do have a number of programs that looks into mobility in Australia. And we have students actually going abroad. All our students who are studying a language spend a semester, a whole year abroad, and then they come back home. And many of our international students come from China, from other places, and study in Australia. What we have found actually to be quite beneficial is that there is a reflection. So keeping a diary, keeping in touch with them, asking them to learn how to articulate what they have gained overseas. And I think that is the key point, is to really identify what they have learned and to teach them how to actually put together a narrative of who have they become by having the experience abroad. So thank you so much also to look into those alternatives when students cannot go abroad, that we do have other options there. Thank you.
I'm not sure if it was a question or a comment, but I'll just say something else about Australia then, because some interesting, in terms of diversity in Australia, the group that I failed to mention there was, of course, the indigenous population, the Aboriginal population. And quite often, people who are involved with the kind of, with Aboriginal communities, with communities which are descended from the white settlers, they don't always talk to each other, and they don't always see the opportunities there for using that kind of cultural diversity. But it's the same, so that's an example in Australia, but it's the same in other parts of the world as well. So where parts of the university are interested in recruiting students from non-standard, non-traditional backgrounds, and people who are recruiting international students, they usually don't talk to each other. But there is actually, there are many, many similarities. The support needs are very, very often the same. And so we need to be better as institutions as well at thinking about that.
Okay, I think it's, I know that Elspeth stirred my mind, but she's also stirred your minds. but we are late for the coffee. And Elspeth will be around. I'm sure she'll be happy to answer your questions. The coffee is downstairs. And also, I know that some of you has had some problems with the Wi-Fi connection. Our efficient organizing committee has solved this. You've got to type two keywords. So we'll post papers such as this outside next to the registration desk. And for those of you who have problems, you can check and copy down and note down the keyword. Thank you.